On our last segment, we talked about the very topical issue of women deacons. And so I'd like to ask our group to think about how the introduction of women deacons, which the Papal Commission is looking at, might transform pastoral ministry. When you think about the possibility of women serving as deacons, how does that change or shake up the church?
One of the things I think that it would do, and I hope that it would do, would be to bring a greater sensitivity to the justice issues of how lay women in general are treated in the church. Because a lot of people who are in ministry, they can be fired with no consequence. They don't have proper benefits. They are not paid a living salary. All of those things are justice issues, and we tend to exploit the women who volunteer in our churches as well. I see women in a role as deacon as being part of the clergy. They are going to have a foot into the door in terms of making some strategic decisions about how it is that we treat women in general as they serve the church. So it doesn't mean it's a panacea. They could just decide also to keep on being unjust to women. But it's going to be at least harder to do that without even noticing. As today, you could have pastoral associates who do a great job, and then new pastor comes, they're fired, they've got no recourse. And if you had women as a class being represented in the clerical community, I think that this would be something that would cause an uproar, as it doesn't today.
You could also have a situation where a husband and wife would serve together as ordained clergy. If you had men deacons and women deacons, which I know they do in some Protestant denominations, which could be a very interesting model, I think, in some places, and interesting for the people in the pews to see that. It also comes with its own challenges and its own problems when you have something like that. I had dinner a couple of weeks ago in San Diego with a Byzantine priest and his wife, and I was asking her, how do you like being the wife of a priest? And she said that it's very challenging. You live in a fishbowl, and things that were familiar to me as a deacon. But she also said that their community is so small, she has to do a lot of things herself that would normally be done by committees of people in a Latin Rite parish. But if it was a husband and wife ministerial team like that could have its whole set of problems and challenges.
So from the Orthodox perspective, obviously we have married clergy. In fact, my wife is the daughter of a priest. So she grew up in this very fishbowl you're talking about. What you do have in a lot of Orthodox parishes, certainly not all, but what you do have in a lot of Orthodox parishes is the wife of the priest does very much take on a very active ministry, right? In the old country, they literally run the church. Here in the United States, they might take over the Sunday school or some youth program or something like that. It's interesting that you propose that you would have both a male and a husband and wife serving as deacons. In the Orthodox Church, that's not likely going to happen. To the extent when it gets reintroduced, and it will get reintroduced, because you can do it the way the Orthodox Church works is really, you have 14 independent churches and they can make these decisions on their own because there's already a historical precedent for it. And it was in existence in the 19th century. It will come back. It will come back, but it will almost certainly come back exclusively with nuns, right? At least in the beginning. It will be, women who have been in monastic vocation for many, many years. It will be almost a sign of a merit, right? It's sort of a recognition of spirituality, of leadership, of so forth. What's unfortunate is they might just stay there, right? They might just stay in the convent rather than really be active in the diocese or active in the parish the way they should be.
But I want to ask you a question. You moved quickly to the example of married priests and the vast amount of unpaid servant labor that their wives take on by virtue of marrying a priest. And so that's not, hopefully kind of not what we're talking about. Now you mentioned the idea of a married couple, and of course, am I right that the wife often does go through a lot of the training with the deacon?
Well, this is something else that varies from diocese to diocese. In my diocese, in the Diocese of Brooklyn, the wives attended classes the first year during aspirancy. Once we began candidacy, it was up to them whether they wanted to keep coming to the classes or not. The overwhelming majority did not. I could count on one hand. We had 53 people who were ordained in my class, and there were just a handful that continued going to the classes. I know there are other places that do require the wives to go.
Wouldn't it be a different dynamic, though, to have a deacon, a male deacon and a female deacon serving in a church, versus when you have a married couple? Would that tend to kind of reinscribe sort of the story of sort of the husband as the head of the family and the wife as sort of the subdeacon deacon? Do I have my minor order straight here? How am I doing? I'm not accusing. I'm just asking. I mean, there are ways in which we could.
And also to, in a sense, it might reinforce the idea that the real role of the woman is to be married, right? Versus having, say, a single woman deacon, for whom that's her primary ministry. How else would you see the role of, would you see women deacons transforming the church, say pastorally? What would that mean for a parish?
Well, I think it could mean a lot. I think it would matter that there was a female face there. I think it would matter that there was a female speaking on her own about the scriptures in a way that isn't invited or derived from someone else. Now I think a lot of her position would depend on reception, and the first reception is the reception by the clergy. And that may be given in some places easier than others. It may be a little easier for a single woman who is sort of seen as sort of herself standing alone, and so it may be interesting to see how sort of the demographics of that shake out. It might also simply be that we would draw on, we certainly have a number of Roman Catholic sisters who would be ideal candidates for this and would be great candidates for this. That would be a different shape to the ministry.
And theologians, I've often thought.
Catherine Lacuna of happy memory, my Dr. Mutter, wrote an article many years ago in which she said that one of the losses for women going through the study of theology is that they're not also preparing to preach. And she says that literally is a diminishment of them as theologians, that they don't have that as the training going on concomitantly with their development as theologians.
I would also like to hope that if women were ordained to the diaconate, that they would bring with them some of their experience in doing the work outside of the sanctuary and in the connection then to what happens in the liturgies. Too often now, it seems to me, clergy come on the scene at the end of a process and bless it, be it with the sacraments or with the Eucharistic celebration or whatever it is. The priest comes in at the end. It's the women who have been preparing the parents for baptism of their child, and then she steps aside and the priest or the deacon does the baptism. I think from all the experience women have had in cultivating and doing formation work, that they would see more clearly that the liturgy is integrally connected to what goes on before, and that the process by which you get people into the sacramental moment is a part of what ministry is about, instead of the thing that somebody else does. And sacramental ministry is confecting the sacrament, using your powers in the liturgical event as an isolated moment.
How would you say, that's a great point, how would you say that it differs from, this may be an obvious question, but I think it's one that's good to sort of bring out. Many people might say there are women and laymen who are doing lay ecclesial ministry, so basically people who are pastoral associates in parishes and all sorts of work. How does the role of the deacon differ from a lay ecclesial minister? What would you say?
It's a great question, because the question really is, what do we want the future shape of ministry to look like? And so are we going to find women who fit the criteria that we're going to lay forward for a women deacon and kind of make them into a new special class, further moving them away? You suggest that there might be dotted lines that would connect these. We can also imagine that they would move away from those lay ministers and just sort of form a new clerical, oh dear, there I go, cast, and that could be a problem. You're my favorite cleric. But the thing is just, I think we need to see how it's going to be and to think of that other underlying sort of widget that's going on here. If we add women, what does it do to sort of the public role of being in the church? And how do we connect that back to the private role of
One of the interesting things, a friend of mine who is a deacon asked his bishop some years back, if you had the choice, if you had to have an administrator for the parish, and you had a choice between a sister and a deacon, which one would you choose? And this was 20 years ago. And he said, without question, a deacon. And he said, really, why? And he said, obedience. That is a key difference, I think, and we touched about this in one of our earlier sessions. The person who takes the person who is ordained takes a promise of obedience to his bishop or her bishop, and that's a big difference between just being a lay ecclesial minister who comes in and out of different ministries and does it in their spare time. I have an investment in my ministry, in my parish, in my work with the church that a lay person doesn't. Because of that connection to the bishop, because of what I have vowed my life to do and to be. It's completely different.
See, I would contest that though, because I know of a lot of places, if they do have a lay ecclesial ministry program in the diocese, it's very much related to this, and they're not doing something simply as a free agent. They really are working in concert with the church, with the pastor, and with the bishop. I think a lot of places don't have a lay ecclesial ministry program, and that's a problem unto itself. But this has been one of the things that is essential to lay ecclesial ministries, that you have to know that it is connected to everything else that the church does, and it's not just something that's a fly-by-night.
But wouldn't you say there is a difference between, say, a lay ecclesial minister, commonly known, say, as a pastoral associate who's working in a parish, and who could be, if he or she wants, a free agent and say, I'm done with this parish or I'm done with this priest, and a deacon, male or female, who makes a promise of obedience at his or her ordination to the bishop, who may say, I want you to stay in that parish. I mean, isn't that a difference in terms of freedom, between a lay ecclesial minister and a woman or male deacon?
I tell you, in practice, I haven't found that to be the case, because I think that I've seen deacons who decided that they wanted to move, and their bishop says, go. It doesn't really, amount to the same thing like the old religious orders where, we're assigning you here and you must be here under a vow of obedience.
Freedom cuts both ways, I just want to say. Many of those lay ecclesial ministers are dependent upon the good will of the pastor to remain employed. And so they do feel that they have to do quite a bit to make that position work. It's not the same, though. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're missing one of the most obvious differences between the two, though, which is the liturgical role.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, a deacon, at least in the Orthodox Church, a deacon actually has more speaking parts, right, during a divine liturgy or Mass than the priest or the cantor, right? It is, whether it's male or female, right, the deacon would have really the primary liturgical role. They're leading the petitions. They read the gospel, right? That would be. I see that as probably the single greatest.
Something that's also worth mentioning here. There seems to be this perception among a lot of people that when you are ordained, you suddenly get a status that's different. In theory, yes. In reality, not so much. I've spoken about this a little bit on my blog and on social media. There are ushers and there are sacristans who get more respect from their parishes than the deacon does. The deacon is, very often he is marginalized. It depends on the pastor, and it depends on the bishop, and it depends on the deacon too, and what kind of a deacon he is, and the relationship that he has. But there are deacons who are routinely never given an opportunity to preach. They are glorified altar boys. Their role within the parish, by design and by the will of the pastor, is very limited and very small. And there's a story that I heard when I was in formation. This goes back almost 15 years ago. I think a lot of the situation has changed, but a deacon arrived at the cathedral in Brooklyn to serve at a Mass. It was not a Mass with the bishop, it was somebody else. And he went looking for the celebrant to let him know he was there. And he found the priest outside smoking a cigarette, and he said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm here, I'm going to be the deacon for your Mass." And the priest snorted, and he said, "If I'd wanted a potted plant, I would have called FTD.
Wow.
So that kind of attitude is out there, and I know a lot of guys around the country who can give witness to that, and anyone who is thinking of ordination being some exalted thing, Not always.
Well, and you can imagine what it would be like for women.
Exactly.
I mean, in a sense, if you have, I was thinking as you were talking, Greg, if you have a bishop in a particular diocese who, let's say this commission recommended and Pope Francis sort of reinvigorates the female diaconate, bishop ordains 5 female deacons, and the next bishop decides he doesn't like them, or the next pastor decides he doesn't want them. And they do become potted plants. That's a very interesting.
And you would probably have a situation, if this were to come to pass, as it was with when the diaconate first came back, each bishop would decide whether or not he would want women deacons.
I used to give the retreat, the winter retreat for the lay ecclesial ministers in the program of the Archdiocese of Chicago. And I did that for a series of years, and it was a wonderful experience. But I noticed that it was women mostly. I mean, we had maybe 1 or 2 men over the course of half a dozen years. And I talked to the director. I said, why is it all women? He said, oh, well, I really worked on this too, but all the men go into the diaconate program. So I think you're talking with lay ecclesial ministry, often people with the same level of commitment as those men who go into the diaconate program, the same theological interest. I mean, this was a really good program in that the diocese paid for half of their theological education. They made a commitment to give them retreats and spiritual direction. All of these things were in place. But guess what? Overwhelmingly, lay ecclesial ministers are women. And why? Because they can't be deacons.
To wrap up our wonderful conversation, let's broaden it out a little bit. I'd like to ask you, in what ways, as you look at the diaconate, male or female, male and or female, in what ways is the diaconate suited or not suited to the needs of church communities today? Maybe we can go one by one.
Well, the diaconate is becoming more and more important in the church in the West, certainly in the United States. And one of the things that I've noticed, it'll be 10 years that I was ordained next year, deacons are being given more and more responsibility within dioceses and within parishes. And the demographic of the diaconate is changing. I think there are younger deacons, there are more deacons that have young families, there are more deacons who are better educated, and that is changing the characteristic of the vocation. And I think it's reflecting very well. The people are hearing a different voice from the pulpit. They are seeing a different kind of life reflected on the altar during the liturgies. And the deacon is able to speak to the concerns of the people in a unique and very powerful and I think intimate way. He is one of them, and he intercedes for them. Whenever he does the prayers of the faithful at Mass, he's interceding on their behalf because he's one of them. And there's something beautiful and very enriching about that, and I don't see any downside.
Nancy?
What I wonder about, and this is heresy I know, is the element of permanence going forward in terms of how young people are today. Will they be able to make that kind of a commitment in a life that they are imagining will have many very significant changes? And does that mean that the diaconate becomes more for older persons, and not this wonderful sense that you have that there are younger men coming in who do this? They're doing it as they're growing their family. That sort of arc might be different for if we have women in the diaconate in terms of when your children are young. Is this a commitment that you can make? There may be some other questions that are involved. So I think that the demographics of who the church is are changing, and I think we'll need to be a little sensitive to that in terms of cashing this out for the future.
To me, I think that if we don't recover a robust sense of our baptism, all of this talk is something dead in the water. It seems to me the only reason why we can expect good things from this development in the future will be if we've really done our homework about baptism and understand how the baptized are the foundation of everything that we do, and how out of that the ordained ministry then functions in a healthy, robust, and life-giving interaction with the other orders in the church.
Speaking again for the Orthodox Church, I think the revival in the United States of a lay diaconate is really important, right? We have a typical parish in the United States might have 300 families. Historically, so we think long, right, 2,000 years, historically a parish that size would have 4 priests and 8 deacons. Today it has 1 priest. Right? And it is just pastorally impossible for one individual to serve all the pastoral needs of 300 families, right? So the recreation or the reinstitutionalization of a diaconal program is just, it's a kind of vital need for the church, right? Just that these communities have needs. They're trying to negotiate a modern world. You know, this is something that the institution can do to meet the reality of the needs of its believers.
I want to thank our 4 distinguished panelists for this wonderful series: Nancy Dallavalle, Greg Kandra, Rita Ferrone, and George Demacopoulos. I want to encourage you to look at the other 2 segments that we filmed on the Diaconate. Segment 1 was on the Diaconate, its history and present practice, and segment 2 was on the question of women deacons. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series. From America Media, I'm Father Jim Martin, and I want to thank Fordham University's Center on Religion and Culture for this wonderful series, Deacons, Women, and the Call to Serve. Thank you.